What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Professor Jeff's lecture series on Plato's Republic. We are continuing today with Book 3, where we are going to talk about a couple of big topics, including what Plato thinks the education of the guardians in his perfect city should be, his thoughts about proper exercise, diet, rest, nutrition, that kind of thing, what makes a good doctor and a good judge and law system, and finally, one of his craziest beliefs out here, the noble lie. Stick around to the end to find out what that is. All right, so to pick up from Book 2 here, quick reminders. We have a few characters here. There's Socrates, there's Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are both Plato's brothers in real life, historically. They're discussing justice. They're discussing the guardian class, who are like the warriors and the police in Plato's perfect republic. How should they be raised? What kind of people should we choose? Because this is like the most important job in the whole city for Plato, right? And it needs to be stationed by the best quality people. How do we get them? How do we ensure that it's the best people? How do we raise them? Okay, these are like the big questions that get answered in this chapter. And then how do we structure society so that these people are willing to protect everybody else, to basically risk themselves, devote their whole lives to protecting others who will really be unable to return that favor. So, while the discussion among Socrates and his interlocutors had centered around whether being a just person was advantageous to the person, particularly without regard to one's reputation, right? So, like, if you're being just for the sake of a good reputation, Socrates argues, like, look, that's not what we're trying to do here, because you can be a bad person with a good reputation. So if you're only being just for the sake of reputation, you might as well be bad and lie effectively and have a good reputation. So remember, Socrates says if we're going to examine the true nature and benefit of being just, it helps to look at it on a larger scale. So because we would say that both a city is just and an individual is just, the city is the larger scale. We're going to look at the city. We're going to examine what justice is in that city. And then if we can arrive at some of the features of justice or discern what justice really is, we can apply it to the individual. So in designing the ideal republic in which justice exists throughout it, Socrates established the necessity of a special class of citizens called the guardians, who protect the city both internally and externally. And in this section of the Republic, Socrates and Plato's brothers discuss how to raise the young guardians so that their temperament facilitates their ability to protect the citizens without becoming hostile and violent, either among themselves or toward the citizens. So through this discussion, they discover some rules for how people should ideally conduct themselves, how music particularly plays a role in this, and the sort of like proper composition of music, appropriate ways to exercise, good medical treatment, and, such and so forth. The book ends, Book 3 of the Republic, ends with one of Socrates or Plato's, depending on who you're attributing the idea to, one of their craziest ideas. Again, very curious what my viewers think about this one. Does the idea of a noble lie make sense to you? Again, we'll get there. We'll discuss it more in detail. I want some feedback on this one, though. So let's begin at the beginning with the education of young guardians. So Socrates begins the book by arguing that since the guardians are such an important class within the Republic, special measures should be taken in their education. So in order to raise guardian children to become both, and these words, these characteristics are so important throughout this chapter, the guardians must be both courageous and moderate. Okay? So in order to raise children to become courageous and moderate or temperate, he says sometimes, adults, guardians, a lot of the most famous poems, which essentially serve as the history for ancient Greece, need to be heavily edited or banned. Okay? He specifically talks about Homer's Iliad several times throughout this book as the sort of text that he has an issue with. So just for anybody who might not know, the Iliad is an epic poem that occurred chronologically and narratively prior to the Odyssey. Now I know a lot of my viewers may have read the Odyssey in high school. It's still a very popular high school text. In the Odyssey, Odysseus, the main character, is traveling home after the events of the Trojan War. The Trojan horse, they all snuck inside. They snuck it across the gates, and they were able to secure a victory for ancient Greece. So the Iliad being the prequel, it's not a prequel, it happened before. So the Iliad being the preceding story before this, chronicles the events of the Trojan War. Okay, and it doesn't focus on Odysseus. The Iliad actually focuses on Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior. This is where we get the idea of the Achilles heel from. And throughout the Iliad, Achilles is basically confronted with his own pride and wrath. Okay, he is the army wants to enlist him in their battle, and he continues to refuse. He doesn't want to put himself in danger. He thinks he is above it, and eventually he concedes and does fight against the opposing general in the other army. The point of all this is that Socrates takes issue with the way that Achilles is represented as one of the greatest historical heroes in Greek history. So to address that first aspect, right, of courage, Socrates believes that it's detrimental for young guardians if they are made to be afraid of Hades, or the afterlife for the Greeks. So a couple of specific quotes from the Iliad that he takes issue with are, "I would rather be on the soil, a serf to another, to a man without loft, whose means of life are not great, than rule over all the dead who have perished." Okay, that's one of them. And there are more that he lists too. These are just two that were really good. "The soul flew from his limbs and went to Hades, wailing his fate, leaving manliness and the bloom of youth." He argues that if the young guardians are more afraid of death than being captured by the enemy, they won't courageously fight to the death, but surrender more easily. The second way that Socrates thinks that Greek poetry should be changed is to remove the suffering and laments of famous heroes. He doesn't say this explicitly, but in our more contemporary understanding, he essentially argues that heroes should be represented as being more stoic than they actually are in the poems. Their emotions should be less volatile. They should be less forceful. He cites a bunch of examples of both heroes and gods from the Iliad being overcome with grief. And he argues that a good person is able to live well independently and would bear loss and hardship more gracefully than an average person. He extends this argument and says that heroes and gods shouldn't be depicted in fits of laughter either. So any kind of extreme of emotion is a bad thing for Socrates. And book 4, little spoiler here, he gets into this a lot more and how it actually is a determining factor of like a just individual is how much they allow their emotions to carry them away. So we'll see that in the next video much more explicitly and straightforwardly. Third, Socrates argues that the truth must be taken very seriously in stories that the young hear. This is because they exist in a subordinate position to most people, right? Kids are sort of at the bottom of the ladder. And they will eventually grow up to be adults who subordinate themselves to the state. Likening citizens of a republic to sailors on a ship, Socrates argues that if the citizens or sailors lie to their rulers or captain, then that jeopardizes the health of the whole enterprise, the city, the ship, whatever organization it is. And finally, he argues that moderation is an important virtue to instill in the young. He defines moderation. I really like this definition. That's why I'm pulling another direct quote here. He says, "It is being obedient to rulers and being themselves rulers of the pleasures of drink, sex, and eating." Okay? Moderating your basest physical desires. So citing examples in Homer that both conform and deviate from his intention, he then argues that there are good speeches in these stories. However, the good speeches should specifically be testaments to the feats of great men without a demonstration of their flaws. Quoting the text here, he says, quote, "Such tales must cease for fear that they sow a strong proclivity for badness in our young." Okay? If the role models in society are shown to be emotionally fragile, dishonest, or excessive in their indulgences, this sets a bad example for the young, and it makes them worse, and they grow up to be less than ideal adults, and these adults will rule the city. So aside from the content of their poetry, Socrates believed that there were elements of the structure, of the poetic structure, that had ethical weight to them. For instance, he argued that first-person narration and then a poet imitating a person in their story was indicative of a corrupted nature of the poet. He also thought the kind of music that people should listen to should be regulated to a degree. He argues that there's a relaxing and a warlike music, two different kinds of music, one relaxing, one warlike. And he argues that each have their appropriate settings and they should not be used incorrectly. And then anything that's kind of like in between or kind of extreme and weird shouldn't have that either. He says, another quote here, "Good speech, good harmony, good grace, and good rhythm accompany good disposition." Ultimately, Socrates argues that regulation of both the content and style of music was a governor's responsibility in order to raise a courageous, moderate, and just population. Okay? So, along with these restrictions on stories told to the young guardians and the kind of music that the public should be exposed to, Socrates argues that there's a proper way to engage in exercise, or gymnastics, as it's referred to in the text. And let's keep in mind some of the historical context here. When he's talking about gymnastics, he's not talking about the Olympic competitions that we watch today. Gymnastics was like naked calisthenics performed in a public arena of some kind. But he does argue that guardians, and by extension all people, should balance hard training with relaxation and indulgence in learning. Indulgence might not even be the best way to put it. We should take a disciplined approach to both exercise and learning. However, this is best achieved through a causal chain beginning with the proper education as described earlier in this book. Socrates argues that proper education and exposure to only good music shapes the soul of a young person in such a way that nurtures their spirit to make them good, and by extension hones their discernment, making them accurate judges of what is good for them and what is not, allowing them to become independent, accurate judges. Okay? So they're raised on good things, good stories, good music. They develop good taste, and then they are able to independently, as adults, choose things that are good for them and avoid things that are bad, and just be able to accurately discern the difference between the two. It's at this point that Socrates makes reference to the forms, one of his most consistent positive theories. So this is going to be a little bit of a flashback here, but as I discussed in the video for book 1, Plato's works are generally classified chronologically into like 3 periods, and this classification corresponds to an evolution in his style of philosophical writing. So Plato's earliest works, the beginning works, purely skeptical, okay? He uses Socrates as a mouthpiece to question the ideas of his time without arguing for a specific conclusion. As we understand Plato's middle and later periods, he becomes more assertive with his own ideas, using Socrates to formulate the existence of metaphysical realities and ethical norms. Most notably is the forms. So at this point in the Republic, Socrates discusses the forms of temperance, justice, and courage. He says that whoever designs the ideal republic and passes judgment upon the kind of music, poetry, and exercise that the citizens can have must recognize these forms as ultimate unchanging realities, from which all instances of temperate, justice, and courageous behavior emanate and share in. The forms exist externally to the physical world, are recognized in the soul of the one who exhibits these behaviors, and then that person is called temperate, just, or courageous. Okay? They apprehend the forms out there. They recognize them in their own soul, enact them, and then are recognized by society as being temperate, just, or courageous. So this discussion, generally here, centers around instilling moderation in young people, with particular emphasis on how to train properly, train the body and train the mind. The discussion of moderation begins with Socrates denouncing the madness induced by sexual pleasure, specifically, and arguing that when a soul is properly shaped by music, it becomes good. And a good soul manifests a strong body. So aside from a hard training in gymnastics, Socrates advocates for dietary restrictions, such as not drinking alcohol or indulging in sweets. But he says that they should practice basic military exercise regimens and eat plenty of roasted meat. I found this section particularly to have some of the highest level of coincidence with many prevalent ideas about health and fitness today. Make of that what you will. So continuing with this discussion of physical health, Socrates gets to the nature of medicine and what a good doctor is and does, as well as judges, like legal judges. So this part of the argument begins with the idea that there is such a thing as giving the body too much medical attention, and that excessive leisure can produce new maladies or illnesses. Socrates argues that excessive leisure would generate a greater need for doctors, which would indicate a serious wrongness in the way people live their lives. He believes that a life filled with challenging physical labor produces the healthiest population. A quote I like that indicates this is, "For all men obedient to good laws, a certain job has been assigned to each in the city at which he is compelled to work, and no one has the leisure to be sick throughout life and treat himself." End quote. Further, Socrates argues that when one has a purposeful job, they take the minimal required medicine and continue their duties when they're able to do so. In this course of action, the body heals properly as regular function is resumed. However, if someone is so sickly that they need constant medical attention, Socrates does actually argue here that it should be refused them, regardless of how rich they are. So there's a little bit of an argument for passive euthanasia here on a wide scale. I don't think the modern medical community would agree with this, but, it's all analysis here. So this leads into a discussion of what makes a good doctor and a good judge, as these will be two of the more important functions within the ideal republic, outside of the guardians, of course. Guardians are number one. Everybody else is after that. So for Socrates, a good doctor is one who is familiar with many different kinds of bodies and as many illnesses as possible. He believes that the best doctor is a somewhat sickly physical state and understands what it is to experience illness. He argues that doctors use their souls or mental functions to treat their patients' illnesses, so the state of their body doesn't need to be optimal. This leads into a conversation about the soul of a good judge. Socrates argues that a good judge must from a young age be naive and idealistic, but eventually learn about the souls of evil men. And it's helpful to consider some of the historical perspective here. The word translated in the text is soul, but what the Greeks understood as the soul is essentially what we today consider the mind. It's this non-physical part of the self that animates the physical. It's the immaterial. It's the motion in the machine of our organic body. Okay? So don't think of it as like the Christian soul necessarily. There are some overlaps, but that's not exactly what he's talking about. So, while he takes into consideration whether an already corrupted nature or soul or mind might make a better judge because it is more experienced with criminal tendencies, he believes that that kind of person will have difficulty apprehending the good and therefore enacting the good in their legal domain. This leads back to the question of how to instill a good soul in the population and in mankind in general. And luckily, we have already answered that question. Good music and a heavily revised historical narrative, such that removes the fear of death, the crying and lamentations of heroes, and a strong drive for truth and truthfulness and a hatred of dishonesty. So, now we're getting into some of the really crazy territory. So after this discussion, Socrates makes an admission that he's somewhat embarrassed about this one idea that would be necessary for the Republic to operate as he planned. He believes that the rulers and citizens of the Republic would need to believe a noble lie, which is really a series of lies about their creation and the nature of their souls. So he says, and this is, again, a direct quote, "I'll attempt to persuade first the rulers and the soldiers, then the rest of the city, that the rearing and education we gave them were like dreams. They only thought they were undergoing all that was happening to them, while in truth at that time they were under the earth, within, being fashioned and reared themselves, and their arms and other roles being crafted. When the job had been completely finished, then the earth, which is their mother, sent them up. And now, as though the land they are in were a mother and nurse, they must plan for and defend it if anyone attacks, and they must think of the other citizens as brothers and sisters and born of the earth. So, the citizens must believe they are born literally of the earth, with their education as kind of a dream, and all of their fellow citizens are actually their siblings. He takes this a step further, even. The noble lie also includes the proposition that every person has a kind of metal in their soul. Some are born with gold in their souls. It's like a tier system. Some are born with gold, and the ones with gold in their souls will form the guardian class. These are the best of the best. Most of the rest of the population will be born with silver, bronze, and iron in their souls. The worth of the metal corresponds to both their ability, function, and status in society. Also, children will have to be assessed for the kind of ore their souls contain. He does say that 2 golden parents can produce a child with silver, 2 silver parents can produce a golden child, and so forth. There is some intermingling there. This is important because he plans to keep the guardians, or the golden class, housed separately from the rest of the population in, get this, shared housing, in which they cannot own property or anything of a valuable nature. He argues that they must be taken care of, having their needs met but not indulged, so that they can remain lean, alert, and this is something he refers to them as a few times, as dogs of war. However, since the rest of the citizens are providing for their needs, the guardians are essentially indebted to them for their care. So he says, we'll tell them that gold and silver of a divine sort from the gods they have in their soul, they'll always have, and they won't need the human kind of gold. Nor is it holy to pollute the possession of the gold in your soul by mixing it with the possession of mortal gold or fine things or lots of wealth. Because many unholy things have been done for the sake of the currency of the many, while the gold in their souls is untainted. But for them alone, of those in the city, it is not lawful to change and to touch gold and discover, nor to go under the same roof with it, nor to hang it from their persons, nor to drink from silver or gold, and this they would save themselves as well as the city. Okay, so 2 or 3 parts to the noble lie here. First, all born of the earth. All that stuff about the education and censoring and editing and rewriting the narratives of history didn't actually happen. This is part of the lie. Next, there's like classes of people, each with a different kind of metal in their soul that indicates their value. And finally, because the highest class have this like immaterial gold in their souls, they cannot possess any of the regular kind because it would sort of corrupt them. And this is the foundation that the ideal city is built upon. The noble lie is truly an interesting concept, but it raises a question for me, at least. If the citizens of a city need to be fed lies in order to remain compliant, is this actually an ideal city? Does this actually facilitate the embodiment of justice? Let me know what you think. Just to recap, in Book 3 of the Republic, Plato writes about the education of the young guardians, how to nurture temperate, courageous, and just people through the proper use of stories, music, and exercise, what makes people healthy, what good doctors and judges are, as well as the noble lie, which will keep the guardian class happily serving the citizens of the city. I'll see you next time for Book 4. Later.